Finally, of the four speakers today, I'd like to introduce Clare Dixon, who's going to expand our horizons to the global perspective. Clare's head of region for Latin America at CAFOD. She's going to speak about the devastating effects of COVID-19 on vulnerable communities in Latin America, but also the Middle East and Asia. So, Clare, over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everybody. It's not quite Swanwick, but I'm really pleased to be here with you, and just impressed that so many of you've turned up on a Saturday morning to this. What can I say? Everything that has been said this morning about the situation in our country can be repeated and is being repeated throughout the Global South. You've probably been looking at some of the news where we now have heard that this week Brazil actually became the second heaviest country of infection. 2 million cases were reported this week, and a total of 78,000 people who have died. And we're hearing from reports from different universities that in fact it's at least 10 times underreporting. You can imagine in this country, if tracing and testing has been so difficult, you can imagine in countries where there is not the same kind of health infrastructure. But I guess in some ways we were taken aback at the way that the epidemic, the pandemic, has attacked the countries of the Global South, because I think within CAFOD we felt that the first countries to be affected really seriously were going to be those countries of Africa where there are so many endemic problems of poverty, vulnerability. But in fact, Latin America has become by far and away the country where the impact has been felt the quickest. There is no doubt that Africa, although at the moment seems to be lagging behind in the terms of numbers of infections, will come up, and therefore we've seen the launch this last week of the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal. But I mean, I guess to start off with, in this country we saw coronavirus as a threat to health. But of course, very quickly it became apparent that certainly in Latin America, where I've been working for many, many years, it's a crisis of hunger. It's a crisis of human rights. It's a crisis of inequality, of gender-based violence, of governance. And as the months have gone by, it's even a crisis of democracy in so many countries. And of course, it's the poorest, it's the refugees, it's the migrants who are hardest hit. Imagine there are 5.5 million Venezuelan refugees scattered across countries in Latin America. They have got no access to any kind of public funds. There's no everyone in policy to support them. And therefore, just as in our own country, we often see who are the first people to be able to respond. And it's the church which has that credible voice, the voice which perhaps is the only voice of moral authority in so many countries where there has been an absence of good governance, and where the vast majority of people who have no stable employment, and we're looking at 70% of the population in many countries in Latin America don't have formal jobs, the church is their recourse. And so it's been an extraordinarily difficult time for CAFOD, and because of course we know so many of these communities, we know so many of the people. Every week I am hearing stories of friends of mine who have died because of coronavirus and their incapacity to be able to access the healthcare and the support that they need. I'm sure many of you have been reading about the stories that Father Ed O'Connell has been sending in from Peru in the tablet, where he describes the absolute destitution of communities who have no recourse to any kind of public funds. And even in those countries where public funds, they've been saying these are available, like in El Salvador, they said, oh, every family is going to get $300. But most families haven't had that $300 because there is no means of tracing families. There is no means of getting families to have bank accounts. And people who don't have birth certificates can't prove their identity. So all sorts of obstacles in their way. But at the same time as this terrible crisis, we have seen just extraordinary courage, huge innovation, initiatives, resilience, resistance, generosity and communities coming together in solidarity. And of course, one of the things that is the first thing that you need is some kind of hope. I would say there are 3 H's in what has been CAFOD's response. One H is the response to health. One has been the response to hunger. And the other has been that response to hope, trying to make hope flourish, to keep hope alive for everybody who is in a situation of close to despair. And one of the things we were able to do immediately, because of CAFOD, as you know, we have long-term relationships with organizations. We were able to say to our partner organizations, please, can you use the money that you already have from CAFOD and use it for responding to this epidemic, responding in every way you can, repurpose that money. And then, of course, we launched the appeal at the end of March, beginning of April, to be able to provide additional assistance. And I guess in one way, CAFOD has been ahead of the pack in terms of being able to respond to the situation in Latin America, because of course the British government doesn't recognize Latin America's needs because many of the countries are middle income. But there has been you know, an enormous kind of outpouring of creativity from our partners, because we know that we have been investing in people's capacity and people's capacity to organize themselves. The first real impact has been on that issue of hunger, because people who go out to work on the streets on a day-to-day basis, if they're in lockdown, they can't go out onto the streets. And people were saying, well, we've got to go out into the streets, because if we don't go and try and sell something or try and hustle or try and sell something on the street, we know that we have got no food. And we would prefer to face up to the virus and the threat of succumbing to the virus rather than watch our children die of hunger. And that has been really so essential. The first thing, one of the first things that we did was work with a regional church organization in Latin America which produces radio programs. People in Latin America listen to the radio. Community-based radio is an enormously important tool for messages, for education, for information, for prevention, but also bringing in stories of compassion, of hope, and saying, what kind of world do we want after this pandemic? And the world in which we have clean water, in which we have justice, in which we have equity for all. It's been really a whole process of inter-community solidarity, and watching the way that people who we have been supporting and who we've had relationships with for years have been really supporting each other. So for instance, we've had a big program of support in São Paulo. São Paulo has got a quarter of all of the cases in Brazil, so nearly 500,000 cases have been identified in Brazil. But we've been working in urban housing situations. It's been in the urban areas that have been hardest hit, because of course people in rural areas can sometimes have access to land, sometimes have access to be able to grow their own food. How on earth can you live in a shanty town or in some kind of slum, keep distancing, and also access food because you can't produce it yourself? And so we've had brigades of people working in different shanty towns and urban areas who have really been able to lobby the government, get food. We've been providing food to 11,000 families in São Paulo who would not be able to access it for themselves. And these are people who've been living on the streets, who've been living under viaducts, etc. Where else it is happening is really serious, has been with the indigenous communities. And we have a situation, as you'll have heard, in Brazil where Bolsonaro, who is being called in Brazil Bolsonaro, because like Nero, he is standing aside and watching as the country burns around him, where it's been taken, COVID has been taken almost as an opportunity to be able to exploit further nature and to build greater development. So for instance, Bolsonaro—
1 minute, thanks Claire.
Bolsonaro has been critical of the church very seriously because of the church's defense of the Amazon, because he sees the Amazon as somewhere which is there to be exploited. Just a brief word about the situation in the Middle East and Asia. My colleague Janet was supposed to be here but couldn't make it, and so she's given me a few little notes to give you about. Across Asia, the Middle East, the same issues. There's underreporting of cases, Tests are not widely available. Symptoms sometimes look like other diseases such as dengue fever. Limited access to healthcare, a major barrier to testing and treatment. The economic and social impact has been devastating for people in cities, but also people without land. The political and rights issues have been absolutely undermined. In the occupied Palestinian territories, for instance, Israel has continued with the demolitions of homes without permits. They've enforced movement restrictions, but the court systems have been closed down, so it's been impossible for our partners to take legal action to prevent these demolitions. So just to say in a word, everything that we're experiencing in Britain is being experienced throughout the global south, and we're still at the beginning of the pandemic in many of the countries. I know that as members of the National Justice and Peace Network, you are absolutely committed to international justice and not just at home. And I thank you for everything that you have been doing up to now in support of CAFOD. And I'm sure you will access some very useful materials on CAFOD's website.
Thank you, Claire.
Will be distributed later. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. And yeah, you're right. I think people are aware of that, but actually, it's important that we don't sort of put our national solidarity, building solidarity within our own communities, over the maintenance of international solidarity. It's I suppose my biggest worry about the time that we're going into is that we just look after ourselves and our own, and actually, it's important that we maintain a global solidarity as much as a national one. So it was really important that you were able to say what you said. And